Okay. Let's open with a word of prayer. Lord, we thank you for this new day, and we thank you for the chance to study and talk about Ezekiel and Palm Sunday and Empire and Egypt. We ask, Lord, that you would give us your peace and help us, Lord, to understand the Bible and this big story that we're a part of. So hear our prayer in the name of Jesus. Amen. All right. Well, we've been through a number of the smaller pieces here, smaller nations. And if we jump ahead to Ezekiel 29, we're going to talk about Egypt today, and we'll talk about Empire, and we'll talk about Palm Sunday. In the 10th year, in the 10th month, on the 12th day, the word of the Lord came to me. Son of man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt, and prophesy against him and against all Egypt. Speak to him and say, this is what the sovereign Lord says. I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster, lying among your streams. You say, the Nile belongs to me. I made it for myself. But I put hooks in your jaws and made the fish of your streams stick to your scales. I will pull you out from among your streams with all the fish sticking to your scales. I will leave you in the desert, you and all the fish of your streams. You will fall on the open field and not be gathered or picked up. I will give you as food to the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky. Then all who live in Egypt will know that I am the Lord. Okay, let's pause there. What's going on?
Well, while I had my car being serviced Friday, I had a chance to kind of read. I always get in a corner where I can kind of be by myself. But as I read through some of these, and it seems like, to me, I don't know, maybe you can explain it, these are like prophecies that Ezekiel is talking about. And as I read through this one and the other one too, especially the one about the prophecy against the king of Tyre. When people think, or the king or whatever, whoever, they own this, or they can have this, like they said, the Nile is mine, I made it. And God is against all that. And when you think you're so high and you put yourself in the place of God, then God don't like that. And, he brings you back down. And so, as I read, I'm like, now, each one of these, is there a reason that they all start out with the prophecy of this or the prophecy of that? This is what the sovereign Lord says. And that's what we're supposed to do. And I just kind of, all these things just kind of go through my head, but I didn't want to start out talking about it,
Well, I'm glad you started out talking about it. Well, what do you think it means, Lil?
To kind of beware and to realize that, we're not above God or whatever. I take things like, I kind of consider myself as being low key on a lot of issues, a lot of things that go on, and I'm thankful that I can get up every morning and put my feet on the floor. But, as far as complaining and all that, I try not to complain because, it's only through the grace of God that, you can not being sick or whatever. And like somebody said something else. Sometimes I donate $5 or $10 to the one of those Indian reservations, and and the kids write letters to people, who give. And I had a letter I re-looked over last night, and I think it was a boy that wrote the letter, and he says he prayed for me and hoped that I don't be sick. And I thought, now isn't that something, that you don't be sick?
Yeah.
And, I'm thankful that I can say that so far. A lot of people are sick, a lot of kids, families, whatever. But, I just kind of get up and do whatever I'm doing and be thankful and not try to overdramatize the fact that it's God who gives you the strength, who gives me the strength to do whatever I do. And to kind of, continue to kind of help Daryl out and think about all the other, people and things that's going on in the world. So, anyway.
That's good. Anybody else have any ideas about this?
Well, this is written before Nebuchadnezzar. Well, he probably attacked Egypt, but so far Egypt was still a big, powerful country. It's not his.
Yeah.
He took on all the other little guys that Egypt used to rule.
That's right.
Now, Egypt would be like, taking out the Soviet Union.
Yeah. Good, Marty.
You just read a few verses more.
Oh, yeah, now you're reading ahead.
Well, you have been the staff of Reed for the house of Israel. When they grasped you with their hands, you splintered and you tore open their shoulders. When they leaned on you, you broke them and their backs were wrenched. That's when they were the slaves of Egypt.
Well, we'll get back. We'll get up to that. We'll get up to that.
Right
I want to stop. I want to stop at verse 6 because that refrain, you might notice, we've seen again and again in the book of Ezekiel. Then all who live in Egypt will know that I am the Lord.
Well, they didn't for years.
They didn't. No, that's right. Well, what will bring the people of Egypt to the knowledge that this is the Lord, and how is that connected with the prophecy? Destruction.
Denial, related to denial, which is their source of life.
That's right. Now so, Son of Man, set your face against Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Okay, that phrase, set your face against, that's another phrase that has, it's not real, we don't really use it in common English. What does it mean?
You're going to get it.
Set your face against.
Speak out against them.
Speak out against them. What is important about the face?
Very revealing.
That's exactly right. I mean, in terms of, we look at body language sometimes, but our faces are how we communicate. And we just do it so implicitly, so naturally. Now, you set your face against. If you have a couple little kids and you hear, some tumult coming up from the back seat, you might turn around and they made a face. Or if they're children of Dutch ancestry, they pulled a face. Because that actually comes from a Dutch saying. But set your face against Egypt. Prophesy against him and against all of Egypt. Okay, what does it mean to prophesy against?
Think of the future.
Well, that's part of it. It's
Give them a message.
give them a message.
A negative message.
A negative message in this case. Well, what were you going to say?
Well, she used a different word about it. She used the
Well-
word negative, I said something, think it's something bad.
think it's something
Wishing
bad.
Something bad for someone.
Well, and this is, when you think of the word apocalypse, which is Greek for revelation or unveiling, what the prophets do is they, in a sense, the Wizard of Oz, they walk into the Wizard of Oz's room and there's a big face and there's fire, and then what's behind the curtain? little man. He's pulling his levers. And that's kind of what Revelation is. You pull back the curtain and the truth is exposed. And this is what prophecy does. It pulls back the curtain. And so there's often a sense of future telling, but it isn't just future telling. It's seeing it to its core. And often the reason that this is connected with the future is that so often it isn't until the future that we see something for what it is. And that's more the relationship with the future than just future telling. So prophesy against Egypt. This is what, and again Lil picked up on this word, this is what the sovereign Lord says. Now what does that word mean, sovereign? Independent, total control. He reigns. And so when he's saying the sovereign Lord, again, we talked about how all the nations had their, the gods were the proxies of the nations. And so when your nation lost, the assumption was that your God was demoted. But now Israel and the prophets change the story, and they essentially say, what the sovereign Lord says to Egypt is this. And in fact, my wife and I have been watching this Netflix series called The Crown. And it's all about Elizabeth's early days. And they always talk about the sovereign. The sovereign. Well, who is the sovereign? The queen is the sovereign, or the king is the sovereign. And so the sovereign Lord basically saying, King, Lord the king over Egypt, and now this God, Israel's God, is making claims on the whole world. And again, someone listening to that would say, psh, why would that petty nation's God make claims on great Egypt? And well, and unlike, Maury made a good point there, that Egypt, so a number of times we went through the history there, Egypt had been vying with Babylon because, where's those maps?
Right here.
Okay. So you can see, well, as long as you can see them, I know what they look like. So you have Babylon way up here in the northeast, and you have Egypt down here in the southwest, and in the middle you have all of these other nations that we've been talking about. You have Judah and Israel and Edom and Moab and Ammon and Philistia and Tyre and Sidon. And so there's also Assyria. And so what these main empires keep doing, they're the big players. These are the role players. These are the bit players. They're the small nations. Now why does Egypt and why do the Fertile Crescent, why do these regions keep getting powerful, and these folks in here always are the possessions of one or the other? Well, sometimes they try to bind together. They're little, but actually it has a lot to do with, and this might warm Maury's heart, has a lot to do with water.
They have the rivers.
What rivers do these guys have up here?
The Tigris and Euphrates.
Yeah, big rivers. And how big are those rivers, Maury?
The Euphrates is about 1.5 times the size of the Sacramento for volume.
Okay.
Tigris is a little bit smaller, but they're big rivers.
They're big rivers.
They're not like the Mississippi
No.
or the Nile.
Or the Nile. And, what does the Nile have? How big is the Nile? What's the Nile like?
The longest.
Probably make it about 5 times the Sacramento size.
Okay. So that's a big river.
it stretches all the way back to the, almost the equator.
Yeah. Now, what's the connection between water and power and empire?
Food.
Where you can grow crops.
That's right. Food, population. In the ancient world, your power was directly related to the size of the army, and the size of the army is directly related to the size of the population, and the size of the population is directly related to the amount of food you can grow. Now, you've got, basically going through the middle of here, you got what?
Desert.
The Jordan. But how big is the Jordan?
Little.
Probably about the size of Kasamis.
The Cosumnes River, okay. How many of you say, we're going to go look at the Cosumnes River today?
If you don't have anything else big, that's big.
Okay. So the amount of food you can grow in here is not like what you got here. So what happens is that these empires are always vying to basically eat up and dominate and exploit these little nations. So what's interesting is that all of these nations get denounced in the previous chapters, but when we go to Egypt, the story changes. And, you'll notice similarities and difference. So right away, the sovereign Lord says, I am against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster lying among your streams. Now let's pause and take a look at this language. Why would God call Pharaoh, king of Egypt, a monster? And what does that sound like? Okay, now when we think of a monster, what is a monster? What does a monster have? He scares you. He has power. Now let's go back to the book of Daniel. So you have chapters 1 through 6, and then Daniel 7, the book changes. And Daniel, we start having these dreams. And what dreams does Daniel have? What comes up, and where does it come up out of?
Probably the Nile, I'm guessing.
No.
The sea, I guess.
The sea.
Yeah.
And up out of the sea comes monsters. Now probably nobody here is paying attention, but if you're into popular culture, Pacific Rim is a movie that's out again, and it's basically about these giant mech robots that people build to fight monsters that come up out of the sea. Now, symbolically, people in the ancient world would have very much understood this language, because in the book of Daniel, the story of the Bible begins in Genesis 1 with what?
Chaos.
The sea. If you read Genesis 1, and at first everything is this watery deep, and it's tohu of ohu, and the Spirit of God hovers over the waters. And what God does is God creates order in the midst of chaos. And there's waters above and waters below. Now it's helpful to realize that, as John Calvin says, Moses writes to the common man. And if you're sitting in, let's say, Egypt or Israel or Babylon, if you go west from Israel, what do you hit?
Mediterranean.
The Mediterranean. You go all the way through the Mediterranean. You get to the end of the Mediterranean. What's there?
Rock of Gibraltar.
Rock of Gibraltar. But then you go beyond that, and what is out there?
Atlantic.
Sea. Sea forever, it feels like. Now, if you go east, and you go east far enough, if you go really, 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 really far, all the way to China, and then you keep going east, what do you hit there?
Water.
Water. Water forever. What comes down out of the sky? Water. If you dig deep into the ground far enough, what do you often find?
Water.
It makes perfect sense that someone in the ancient world would look at this and say, there's water everywhere. Because there is. So you have these waters, so now symbolically, the book of Daniel, you have the great sea, and out of the great sea comes monsters, right? And these monsters in the book of Daniel represent something. What do those monsters represent?
Empires.
Empires. Now let's take a look at this. I'm against you, Pharaoh, king of Egypt, you great monster lying among your streams. What is Egypt?
Nothing, if you're a monster, but you only have a stream.
Well, yes. But the symbolism is, again, it's similar to Daniel. It's this, but here the streams are what for Egypt?
Their life.
They're the source of its power. And so, just like in the book of Daniel, where these monsters rear up in the book of Daniel, and they trample the earth, and they gobble up the kingdoms. Well, this is the same as Egypt gobbling up Edom and Moab and Judah and Israel, and it's the same story. Now, you say, the Nile belongs to me. I made it for myself. Who's saying that?
Egypt.
Pharaoh, king of Egypt. Now again, remember, in the ancient Near East, it is often the case that, and it's very definitely true in Egypt, so if you have, well, in Egypt actually you have, at the beginning of this week, my wife and I are going to go down, going to take a couple days off in Southern California, and we're probably going to go to the Getty, because that's one of the things we like to do. And when we go to the Getty, we're going to look at Egyptian art. And, well, were Egyptians monotheists or polytheists? Polytheists. You have all of these gods. And you have the god of the sky, and the god of the sun, and the god of the Nile, and the god of death, and the god of life, and you have all of these gods. Now, you've got Egypt down here, and all of these gods, you're dependent on all of them. Well, what you have in their theological, cultural system is, in a sense, you have a mediator. And that mediator is enthroned by the gods, and his job is to, and if you look at Egyptian imagery, you see Pharaoh, his job is in a sense to bring life to the nation. And that's why in Pharaoh, in Egyptian culture, in Egyptian religion, spirituality, politics, it's all one thing. Pharaoh is God. He works and takes the power from all these gods, and he embodies the God sitting on the throne, and then he brings life to Egypt. Now, if you remember the Joseph story, now there's a famine in all the world, right? And what's the last place that seems to have food?
Egypt.
Now, that makes perfect sense. The famine's probably connected to a what, Maury?
It has to be a big high-pressure tunnel that goes over that part of the world.
Okay.
Big enough to block the monsoon because of rain in Ethiopia.
Yeah. So, probably a drought. Because a famine, well, stuff isn't growing. Why isn't stuff growing? Water. Now, Egypt's got the biggest river in the area. You know the story. Joseph has the dream. 7 fat years, 7 lean years. Here in California, we've had a little bit of experience about what a drought can be. Pay a little bit of attention to Cape Town, South Africa right now. They're running out of water. And it's getting pretty grim. Well, you don't have water, things get desperate fast. So then what Joseph does is Joseph has these warehouses full of grain, and he sells grain, and then the people run out of money because the farmers can't sell grain themselves. And so what does Pharaoh do? It's not often noticed in that Joseph story, but it's very clearly there. Pharaoh owns all the land. So, you still need grain, huh? You don't have any money, huh? You don't have any animals, huh? What you got? I got my land. Okay. You'll sell the land to me and I'll give you food to eat. But what does that mean? Pharaoh owns everything. Now all of this stuff is in these systems. And so now he says, the Nile belongs to me. Well, okay. Then he takes another step. This is what Lily was talking about. I made it for myself. Well, Pharaoh would say this because Pharaoh says he's God. It's pretty common stuff in ancient empires. Now, what does the Lord... Now, he's a monster, right? Lying among the streams. He's living in the watery depths. Now, the Lord comes along and says, what? But I will put hooks in your jaws. So, what does the Lord say about all of this?
He's in control. You may think you're the boss, but I am.
That's right. You may think you're a monster living in your streams and you've got all this power and all of this here, but you're nothing but a big fish in a stream. And I'm going to hook you and make the fish of your streams stick to your scales. I don't quite know what that means, if that's similar to when sometimes you see sharks and these other fish that suck onto them, getting the parasites. I will pull you out from among your streams with all the fish sticking to your scales, and I will leave you in the desert, you and all the fish of your streams. Okay, you haul a big, where is that, Maury? They have the sturgeon in a hatchery. Is that up north from here? Yeah, maybe it's in Oregon. I remember visiting a hatchery, and they have these huge sturgeon. Maybe that was Columbia River.
Might be a Watery.
Yeah, I don't remember where it was, but
They have in Russia,
but if you've ever seen a sturgeon, they're these huge fish.
Well, they're in fact in a river.
Yeah, there's some here.
Yeah.
Because my father caught one.
Oh, really? How big?
I don't remember, it was big.
You can't eat them unless they're over a yard long.
Well, it was big enough, that's because he was in the deep.
Really?
Yeah, it's been many years ago.
Well, so in our rivers here, they have these sturgeon, and these sturgeon are enormous. And you see some of them, they're 12 feet long. That's a big fish. Now, you take a fish like that, and you flop it in the desert. This is such vivid imagery, isn't it? Because, boy, I'll tell you, you're swimming in a stream and you see one of those sturgeons, what are you going to do?
Get out.
You're going to say, it's a monster. You're going to get out of the water. Now the Lord says, I'm going to put my hooks in your jaws. I'm going to pull you out of that stream. I'm going to flop you in the desert. Let's see how you do there. But what's going to happen to that 12-foot sturgeon in the desert? And it's going to stink. It's going to rot. It's going to die a slow death. You will fall on the open field and not be gathered or picked up. You won't even be food for or one of the other players. I will give you as food to the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky. Now in the sermon today, I'm going to focus on, so Palm Sunday is always an interesting challenge for a preacher, because you preach on the same story every year, and so you always look for some other aspect of the story. And since we're in Mark, we're going to focus on the wild beasts. And one of the interesting things about Mark is the Gospel of Mark has some additional language that shows some sensitivity to some certain things. One of the interesting things about Mark is Mark doesn't have a lot of detail in the temptations of Jesus, which is in all the Gospels. It was a very important symbolic and theological moment in the story of Jesus. But Mark has one interesting addition to that. When Jesus is out in the wilderness, he's out there with the beasts, the wild beasts. And one of the things that almost nobody notices about Palm Sunday, everybody's paying attention to the palms and the singing and the Hosanna and the donkey. But what people never notice about the donkey is this is a donkey that hasn't been ridden. Now we got a lot of folks here that are city folks, but Edie isn't a city folk. Edie grew up there in Montana. Talk to me, Edie, if you ever came up to a horse or a donkey that had never been ridden, can you just hop on that animal's back?
I wouldn't stay on it very long.
What do you got to do to get an animal like that ready for riding?
Tame it. You gotta tame it first so they trust you, and then bit by bit get it used to the bridle, get it used to the saddle before you ever get on it.
That's right. So Jesus intentionally picks an animal that's never been ridden. Now, everyone there who knew that would have been in awe about what happened.
The animal allowed him on it.
Right. Which says what about Jesus?
Over nature, over animals.
Jesus is the God of nature. He owns it. Whereas when we come up to an animal, we have to, and we use this language with horses, we have to break that animal, which basically means we have to break their will and make them submissive to us. This animal that Jesus rides is naturally submitting to him.
And not just riding it. It was amongst the crowds and the noise. And he still was
That's right.
a problem.
You take a wild animal, you might even take a semi-wild animal like my little dog. And, my little dog, you come into my house, my little dog's going to try and bite you. I was visiting a pastor friend this week over in Alameda. He's got a little dog. His little dog isn't mean like my little dog. His little dog is excited. It's like a rabbit when you come in that house. That dog's just jumping all over you. But take a crowd. You look at the story of Jesus and you look at it from the point of view of wildness. And then Jesus basically comes into town and says, I am Lord of all. I'm Lord of Jerusalem. I'm Lord of nature. Well, this story, God is saying the same thing. I will give you as food to the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky. Well, why is God feeding the beasts of the field and the birds of the sky? Because they're his. In other words, we human beings, our relationship to nature, I actually, so some of you notice that you have people coming to church now for my videos. And these are the kinds of things I talk about in my videos because it's the kind of stuff C.S. Lewis would talk about. What's our relationship to nature? Now, if you're a materialist, which means that you say all we are is our atoms and the products of physics, that means that our brains, our minds, our choices are all part of nature. But we don't live that way. We break horses. We tame rivers. We catch fish. We mine ore. we dominate nature in order to build our empires. What is God saying in this story? I am the sovereign Lord. I am over all of this. Nature is my possession. But you, empire, rebellious Egypt, you're my possession too. And you think you're a monster. I'm going to put hooks in your mouth and haul you up and bring you out into the desert. Now, here's the funny thing about biblical symbolism. The whole story of Israel leaving Egypt, if you read the early chapters of Exodus, Egypt is a watery place. Well, that water goes two ways. On one hand, the water is kind of like the streams and the monster. On the other hand, the water is kind of the source of life. Now, what does God do with Israel when he takes Israel out of Egypt? Where does he take them? To the desert. So
through the Red Sea, though.
that's right, through the Red Sea. See, all of this language is communicating to the ancient peoples. Now, we've lost touch with this way of speaking. That there's actually two kinds of chaos land. One is the watery deep, and the other is the desert. And part of why I figured this out is that in the watery deep are the monsters, and they're in Hebrew, the tanin. And so if you go all the way back to Genesis 1, one of the things you never read in Genesis 1, or don't pay any attention to, is that God makes the tanin, and the tanin are the sea monsters. Now that's interesting, because you read about it about Leviathan in like the book of Job and in the Psalms. And you always read how the Lord rode Leviathan and the Lord harnessed Leviathan. And this is a way of saying that God, God is God even of the chaos here and can harness it at his will. Psalm 18 is this amazing psalm where the beloved of the Lord cries out. And we actually have songs of it in our old Psalter hymnal where God comes down from heaven and smoke comes out of his nostrils. And you think, well, why does smoke come out of God's nostrils? Well, what's that imagery say? God is all-powerful. And just like C.S. Lewis says in Narnia, is Aslan a safe lion? No, he's not safe. Well, he's not tame. He's wild, but he's good. And so this is all the imagery. And so, one of the things I notice is that tanin in Genesis 1 speaks about the sea monster that God makes, but tanin is also in the desert, but in our English Bibles, you know what the tanin in the desert is? The jackal. And you'd say, well, what does a jackal and a sea monster have in common? Well, they're the creatures of the chaotic no land. Now, what is a jackal? It's a wild animal. It's kind of a dog-like animal. I don't think they've managed, they might be able to domesticate. Have they ever domesticated a coyote? That's the closest thing we kind of have to it here. But someone would say, who'd want to domesticate a coyote? We domesticated wolves.
You hear about dogs that are half coyote, half.
That's right. But so why would the Bible use the same word for the sea monster and the jackal? Because it's kind of the wild animal of the desert. Now, God takes Israel out of watery Egypt into the desert, but what does God do in the desert, and why is that important?
provides for them.
That's right. Manna comes from heaven. Water comes from the rock. And God gives Israel life in the desert, in the place where, it's inhospitable to life.
Don't we, instead of waiting on God, we create our own fish hatchery, so we get fish when we want it?
Yes, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. We don't want to be dependent on God. But now, what God is saying here to Egypt is, the Nile belongs to me, says Pharaoh. I made it for myself. And what does God say?
You can.
Yeah, no,
No,
I don't think so.
no. And it's just like Lil began the class with, we think we're something. We think we've got this world under control. We think, and God says, nope, you do not have this world under control. You do not have your own future secured. Now, zip forward to the year 2018, and we have all this power and all this technology. Do any of us feel like we've got this world under our control?
No, we don't feel safe either.
We don't feel safe either.
but even just the storms,
Yeah.
no. Everybody's kind of on edge, whether you're on the East Coast or the West Coast. I mean, it's just, they can't predict.
And so here we are. But now we'll get into the second part that Marty was starting to read. You have been a staff of reed for the people of Israel. When they grasped you with their hands, you splintered and you tore open their shoulders. When they leaned on you, you broke, and their backs were wrenched. Okay.
They had a alliance with Egypt to save them.
So again, back to kind of the geopolitical.
To me, what that right away said to me, and maybe I'm wrong, of course, I'm possible that I'm wrong. That was when they were slaves for 400 years.
Well, see, part of what the Bible does is do a lot of repetition. And so the way the Bible likes to tell stories is when something is happening in the contemporary, it reminds us of what happened in the past. And we're implicitly doing the same thing here when we're reading this story. Because we're reading about Israel, and we're talking about water and self-sufficiency, and we're talking about the story of what happened back in the 6th century BC. But we're thinking about ourselves, because we're just like them. And so I think probably, Marty, so what happened was, again, you have the major empires up here of, the Tigris and the Euphrates and of the Nile. And one of the strategies to live as a little player here is you're always looking for a bigger friend to support you. And so let's think about good King Josiah. Now, if you grew up with Bible stories, you know that Josiah was this good king who finds the book of the law in the temple and reforms Israel. And that's the story you learn as a Sunday school as a kid, but you don't often hear about how Josiah dies. Josiah dies because, Babylon is on the rise, and Assyria is nervous, and Egypt, that had been enemies against Assyria, is now more afraid of Babylon. And so Egypt is going to march its army up here to ally with Assyria to beat back Babylon. But King Josiah is more worried about Assyria than it is about Babylon at the moment. If you remember King Hezekiah does something famous.
He lays out a letter to God.
Well, yeah, by the Assyrians, but they're afraid of Assyria. So then other visitors came from Babylon, and what does King Hezekiah do? Shows them everything. Shows them, tries to play the petty monarch where, look at the gold we have. And the prophet comes to Hezekiah and says, that wasn't a good idea.
You're gonna lose it all.
You're going to lose it all. But Hezekiah is worried about Assyria, so Egypt is going to come up and ally with Assyria to try and beat down Babylon, and King Josiah goes out with his army at the plains of Megiddo, and attacks the Egyptian army to try to stop it, but little Judah doesn't have the stuff. Egypt destroys his army. Josiah loses his life. Because Egypt beat them, Egypt goes up here, but Egypt then basically takes control of this whole region again. And so then, Josiah's sons, they take his oldest son, his best son, hauls him into Egypt as exile, puts number 2 son in there, who is considerably more worthless. And what does this son naturally think about where his help comes from? Egypt. Now read these verses and see how they listen. You have been a staff of reed for the people of Israel. Now, a staff, the Lord is my staff. You'll hear that in the Psalms. But you're a staff of reed. What's a reed?
Waving in the wind.
That's right. It's not oak. It's not hemlock. It's reed. And you might find a thick enough reed that seems like it has some strength, some rigidity. And you have been a staff of reed for Israel. When they grasped you with their hands, you splintered and tore open their shoulders. When they leaned on you, you broke and their backs were wrenched. What's the picture drawn here?
They leaned on Egypt and ended up falling over.
That's right. Why, they're a staff of reed. Everyone says the smart play, stick with Egypt. Egypt will save you from Babylon. Will Egypt save Israel from Babylon? No. So the Lord is saying, you grabbed a staff of reed. Where should they have put their trust? In the Lord. They should have put their trust in the Lord. Where instead did they put their trust? In Egypt. They put their trust in empire. And this then gets into this long story throughout the Bible. Remember when we looked at previous chapters where, remember, Israel and Samaria are young girls who are playing the prostitute, so they're the feminine. Who is the masculine in those stories? Well, there's Babylon, there's Assyria, there's Egypt, and then there's the Lord. And you say, why the feminine and the masculine? Well, that's because of the roles they're playing here. Because Israel and Judah are dependent. These are dominating. And so this is this long story of empire throughout the Bible. We are always tempted to trust in what instead of God?
Man, that's man.
And we're tempted to trust in empire. No, how does that work for Americans?
Strong army, strong government.
That's right. We trust in the United States of America. And I think the prophets would say, you're looking at a staff of reed. Now this is complicated because we're citizens of a country. We should be loyal, and we have loyalties to our country too, but the way we work this out theologically is we always say, who comes first, God or the flag? God comes first. And maybe as a good Christian, you should be loyal to your country. That's part of your duty. But there's always one with a higher duty. And that's also why we say in our system, remember Egypt, Pharaoh is what in the Egyptian system? Pharaoh is God. Well, is the president God? Even in our system, what should the president be below? We have this saying, no man is above the law. In a sense, what we do in a democracy, in a secular democracy, is we divinize the process. And that's why you go back into the 17th, 18th, 19th century, we have a president, not a king. But if, for example, you say, okay, well, England has a king or a queen, well, even in England, what is that? Well, only titular. But let's imagine, let's get rid of Parliament and put Elizabeth back on a real throne. Even there, in the history of these Christian sovereigns, the king or the queen of England would have to be below who? God. And that tradition comes from the Bible, where so you have the kings, and then you have the prophets. And what do the prophets do with respect to the kings?
Speak for God.
They speak for God. They go to the king. So David sees Bathsheba, takes her, tries to cover it up, kills Uriah. Who shows up on David's door? Nathan the prophet. And what does he say?
You are the man.
You are the man. David, you are under God. And you find this, we've been going through, we'll get back to the kings again with Elisha and Elijah and the prophets. This is a repeated thing. Now here in this story, the prophet Ezekiel prophesies to Pharaoh and basically says, hey buddy, you are under God. And then now in the second part, Israel, that should have known better, grabbed for this staff of reed. And what happened to Israel when she grabbed for this staff of reed? It broke, and she broke. It broke her, which is exactly the story of what happens with Israel. Because Israel allies with Egypt, and Egypt will say, oh, okay, yeah, you pay me all this money, I'll protect you. But if the cost of protecting Israel gets too high, what does Egypt do? Forget you. Egypt isn't loyal to Judah. Well, yeah, they don't need them. Now, what happens in the Christian story? What does our God do for us this week?
He sacrifices himself.
That's right. Will Israel sacrifice itself for Egypt? No. Or will Egypt sacrifice itself for Israel? No. Israel is expected to sacrifice itself for Egypt. God comes and says, you will never find another master like me. I sacrifice myself for you. What does the good shepherd do?
Lays down his life for his sheep.
Lays down his life for his sheep. That's the good shepherd. Jesus says, I am the good shepherd. See how, you read this stuff in Ezekiel and you think, what does this have to do with anything? It has to do with everything. Let's pray. Lord, the world is full of reedy staffs that we put our trust in. But you come to us, and you're the only sovereign who dies for his people. And so, Lord, you're the only sovereign worth serving. So help us, Lord, to rightly acknowledge and honor the nation, the civil magistrates, because, Lord, you have given them authority and given them a job to do, and we play our roles. But help us, Lord, to remember that ultimately we belong to you. And the nations and empires of the world owe you their allegiance. So help us, Lord, to serve only you. Hear our prayer. In the name of Jesus, amen.